Hi, this is Dr. John Grazel, and this is another video in our series on international development. It's an addition to our work on institutions, and it focuses on a distinction that I think is very critical in the world today, poorly understood: the difference between secular and sacred institutions. And the difference between these and their inability to work together is the cause of much conflict today, and based very much on a misunderstanding each of the others. Now, what is critical is to realize this is not an absolute dichotomy. You have to analyze each thing in its context and how it's performing at the moment. So there are religious and sacred institutions that actually have secular purposes and functions, and vice versa. There are secular institutions that act very much in sort of a religious fashion. The NGOs that have ultimate meaning and purpose. People have businesses like small bookstores that seem to have ultimate meaning and purpose, motivation, and religious groups that are really fronts for the economic benefit of those who run them. Now, we know institutions exist to maintain stability. We have people at events, we have great ideas, but when we put them together in a regular and repetitive manner, we create forms we call institutions that seek, through incentives and constraints, to basically keep things on a steady keel. And that generally is what we think of as secular institutions. Institutions that we create in order to achieve purposes that have to do with our being human beings in a contingent reality living on this earth. We need health, we create hospitals, we need education, we create universities. We create things that let us accomplish our purpose over a sustainable period of time. But sacred institutions are different, where secular institutions use incentives and constraints to maintain stability based upon generally rules and regulations that outline what is expected. Sacred institutions actually are based upon creating an allegiance to something of a higher purpose. And they do that through rituals and doctrines or dogmas that seem to ally the behavior of their members with the higher purpose they are trying to attach to. Now, in this sense, secular institutions are anchored in human beings and who are the members, and it is the effect on those human beings that make them work or not work. Sacred institutions are really focused on a higher purpose, a higher meaning, and it's from that source of that higher meaning that they seek to get the understanding of what their institution is supposed to be. And as a result, they measure success very differently. A secular institution measures success according to the efficiency by which it obtains its purpose. How well does the market really correspond to supply and demand? A sacred institution, however, measures success to the extent to which it protects and furthers that doctrine for which it has been established to reflect. In terms of secular institutions, a key concept that often isn't included is that of transaction costs. And that's because in addition to the formal costs and rules and regulations, there are transaction costs of the individual. I may have a salary as part of being an employee, and that's formal. How it affects my life with my family is informal. It's a transaction cost, but it weighs on me and affects my behavior. I go to a bank, I get 7% loan, but does it take me a day or a month to fill out all the papers? That's a transaction cost. That needs to be factored in to really understand whether or not a secular institution is working. In a sacred institution, it's different. In a sacred institution, what we're focusing on is something called correspondence. Success is measured by the extent to which the institution itself actually corresponds to the design, the vision of that which it is trying to attach to and reflect. The Christians used to have a concept called City of God that did that. And so that degree of correspondence is what makes a successful sacred institution. Therefore, when you try to improve these institutions in a secular institution, where you're concerned about transaction costs, you're concerned about how it affects the individual and how it motivates the individual. In a sacred institution, where you're working for correspondence with a larger vision and you seek a relationship with that larger vision, you're looking at the correspondence of the community, of the individuals themselves, and does their relation with each other correspond to what is a reflection of that higher purpose. Now, if you want to change these institutions, therefore, you have to focus it on these two different aspects. If you want to change a secular institution, you've got to get at the incentives and the constraints, and particularly at those who have the power and the resources to change those incentives of constraints. And that's why you have exercises where secular institutions revision, reorganize each other, but nothing really changes because the powers that control the resources that affect the incentives and constraints don't change. In a sacred institution, if you really want to have transformation and you want to change the relationship, you've got to actually change the vision that the community is trying to correspond to. Without the change of vision, the institution itself will not change. Now, the problem we face in the world today is we have these different types of institutions going. For instance, we have secular civil law and we have religious laws. And religious laws see their law as a reflection of a divine purpose and greater design. The secular see it as a mechanism, an instrumentality for achieving their purpose. When they get together, they pass each other in the night. What happens too often is secular institutions want to deny or tell sacred institutions what their sacred vision is based on the secular institutions' understanding of facts. So secular institutions, the minute they meet a religious institution, they say, oh, you believe in some guy with a white beard up in the sky who controls everything, and we know everything is chemicals and atoms. Sacred institutions do a corresponding version of this where they try to tell secular institutions what are the facts based on their vision. So they say, well, we have a vision that humanity and mankind is the result of a conscious creation of a greater power, and therefore we think things happened in the Garden of Eden 6,000 years ago, and we don't care about any of the evidence you have that there's some process of evolution, and that we have to maybe better understand our vision in terms of this reality. So each of them tries to tell the other what the other actually is or believes, rather than doing what's really necessary, which is having a dialogue between them. And if you want to have a dialogue, then the secular institutions have to begin by learning the vision of the sacred institution and then working with them to understand how what they're doing does or does not correspond to what they claim is their sacred vision. Conversely, if a sacred institution wants to work with a secular institution, it's got to begin by really understanding the empirical facts and purposes of that secular institution. And then it should be working with them as to whether they're really getting, in terms of practical consequences, what they claim or what would be most effective given those facts and purposes. Then, if they can put them together to see if there's a harmony between the sacred and secular purposes, they actually can work together. Now, to do that, if you belong to one camp or another, you've got to understand how the other camp thinks. If you want to understand secular institutions, here's a fabulous book, Nobel Prize winner Douglass North, on institutions, institutional change, and economic performance. And he has a very broad understanding of economics. But basically, Douglass North really lays out in this book how institutions work, how they change, and particularly how transaction costs are really key to understanding individual motivations within secular institutions. This is a book by Paul Lample, who's a member of the Universal House of Justice, Creating a New Mind, and in it he tries to present the Baha'i vision of what is sacred and discusses how Baha'i institutions and Baha'i communities should be acting in ways that correspond to that sacred vision. If you read those two books, you'll get a good sense of how these two different perspectives play off each other, and how they can harmonize and actually reinforce each other if they understand each other, take each other seriously, and really try to dialogue with each other rather than debate or actually destroy.